Okay, welcome back. When we last left off on Unit 1, we had first the lecture on Paleolithic to the Neolithic, and then we talked about the art impulse, the existential art impulse, making a mark. And so that lecture led us to a certain amount of discussion about expressive mark making. And so that raises the next question, which is, what does it mean to be expressive? What does it mean to be gestural? What does it mean to make a mark that is distinctive or expressive or energetic or gestural? And as we're talking about that, that also then leads to us talking about what is a mark and what is a line. What's the difference between a mark and a line? Which is the most fundamental unit in an art, the art element. And so we're going to be talking about that. And so this lecture will probably be about 2 parts, and we'll cover most of that. And then that should eventually lead to us talking about drawing. And then that'll be the last lecture for Unit 1. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this idea of gesturalness. Um, Something I don't think I covered in the Paleolithic lecture, but when like the first cave paintings in Altamira were discovered, people were quite amazed because the artwork seemed very sophisticated and very loose and gestural in a very kind of modern sort of way. And this surprised people. But I think what's in some ways interesting is to wonder why. Why was it surprising? Why were people amazed that people could find this kind of loose gestural way of making art? And we're going to return to that question in a couple of different ways. So, but keep that question in mind. Why is that a surprising idea? So let's talk a little bit about what does it mean to be gestural, right? The word gesture, right, refers to the action of the artist, the actual physical act of the artist, how they make a mark. And the word gesture also refers to the gesture of like a model, like the thing that you're drawing. So a gesture drawing, like the traditional sense of a gesture drawing, would be a drawing that you're doing of a figure and is trying to capture quickly the gesture of that figure as fast as possible. And so it's both a direct reflection of the gesture of that pose, and it's also a direct reflection of the gestures, the action of the artist, the very movement of their arm. So my drawing teacher, back when I was an undergraduate, she used to say this kind of mantra that like every mark you make is a direct reflection of the gesture of your body. And I think that's a very true statement, but it's also sometimes can be a little bit confusing because it gives you the impression, therefore, that anyone can be good at making any kind of gestural mark. And that's not always the case. Some take a lot of practice to learn how to do it quite right. And some types of gesture may appear to be made really, really loosely, but actually require lots of control. And so the other thing I want you to think about with this distinction, this set right here, is that they are all in a way gestural in just different ways. Like the Ellsworth Kelly drawing is gestural in the sense that it's a reflection of a very tight and controlled mark making gesture system, right? That he is drawing in a way where it's a very controlled use of his arms and his wrist, right, and his fingers to make that mark as in that very precise and that very specific kind of manner. That is a reflection of his gesture just as much as this Motherwell is a reflection of a very different kind of gesture. But it's also probably true that this maybe looks a lot more energetic than the gesture that made it. The gesture was probably a lot more controlled than one might think. So here's another way to think about gesture, something that I find kind of interesting, is that gesture is hard to teach. Students sometimes have a really hard time learning to be gestural and require a lot of kind of being talked into it. I think the reason is in part because students are afraid of what they're giving up and they don't want to be gestural because they will lose control, and they feel like the control is how they are able to control whether the drawing is good or not. And it takes a lot of cajoling sometimes to convince a student that you can actually create things much with a lot more freshness and actually things that you're a lot more proud of by losing a little bit of control. Um, so gesture is not easy. Sometimes gesture takes lots and lots of practice for people to start to get good at it. So this brings us back to this idea of um, a gesture and a mark and expressiveness, right? We use the term expressive, and I think or an expression, and I think actually most of the time when we say expressive, what we really mean is energetic, right? That when we say that's a very expressive mark, we're not really meaning it's expressive. We don't really mean that that mark says something very particular to us and communicates an exact emotion. Instead, what we mean is that that mark has a lot of energy. It was very active and very energetic. It showed a lot of energy in the action that made it. And we see that as being expressive. But I think we need to always be kind of careful when we use that term expressive, because oftentimes we're not all that clear as to what is being expressed. So wait, hold just for a second. I have a little bit of a digression because I think sometimes it's easy, like if you think about where we started with this kind of comparison, it's easy sometimes for us to think about all of pre-industrial cultures as having, or pre-Western civilization cultures as having a certain kind of looseness and expressiveness um, that is tied to that same sort of expressiveness that we think of as being tied to primitive cultures and tied to like the Paleolithic cave sites. And I think that that is too easy and often a false connection that we need to be careful about. Just because there is a certain kind of similarity from here to here to here, right, doesn't necessarily mean that those similarities say all that much, right? That they're, and when you really start examining them, you see that they are in each way, um, they are both, each of these is in some ways extremely controlled and in some ways extremely loose and gestural. But the balance between the decisions that are controlled and the decisions that are loose and gestural are quite different. To give you an example, in the Rothenberg, a lot of the control is on this kind of outside edge and this interplay between the dark and the light on that outside edge. And then the looseness is in the very kind of energetic filling of the space in between and the filling of the outside space. Um, and that's not the case with this wild horse from the Lascaux cave. The looseness and the control are a little bit more kind of unified. They're not so much in opposition to each other. Whereas in this Yuan dynasty painting, um, the the looseness is much more kind of kept in just small moments, just small mark moments. Whereas overall, this overall design and structure of the piece is very, very controlled, tighter than the other two. And here's another example of a similarity and a comparison that can be overly stated, right? Both of these look extremely loose and gestural, and they both look extremely expressive. But to assume that therefore the artists were making these artworks for the same reason, with the same intent, is to, I think, make a mistake. We can't, we can't assume that, and we have to always be willing to, but we can't assume that this is necessarily primitive, and this is, we're getting close to the 9-minute mark. So I'm going to wrap up for part one, and then we'll get to part two. All right, thank you.